this is the periodic table of elements, all the elements that kind of exist, and this is basically what makes up chemistry. And we sort of look at these elements, and remember what we're seeing here is that each of these elements are made up of the same type of atom. Now the reason I show you this is because when we talk about the periodic table of elements, we've got things like the hydrogen atom, we've got the sodium atom, we can have the chloride atom, we can have the potassium one as well. The main one we want to focus on is the carbon atom. The uses of carbon and the applications of carbon, especially in organic chemistry, are endless. Organic chemistry is a very, very big topic, and as you progress from year 11 chemistry to year 12 and year 13 chemistry, you just develop more knowledge on your baseline. So it's really important to make sure we know all these very basic understandings and concepts of organic chemistry. So when we talk about organic chemistry is the study of the structure, properties, composition, reactions, and preparations of carbon-containing compounds, okay? Now, you guys may be familiar, and one of the ones we're going to be talking about is hydrocarbons. So these are compounds that contain hydrogen and carbon. But a lot of other organic chemistry, carbon is the main constituent. However, carbon can also then form compounds with things like oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, etc. Now, this branch of chemistry was originally sort of limited to things like human biology, but we've obviously found so many other uses for carbon and hydrogen containing compounds. It's now sort of applicable across many different industries, such as pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals, as we will see, paints, cosmetics. You know, there's a lot to learn from the organic chemistry of organic compounds. Okay, so this is just to sort of give you a bit of background information, sort of orientate you about why we're talking about this. Now, again, putting things into context, we can't just talk about organic chemistry in the sense of chemistry and the periodic table of elements and compounds. Don't forget that majority of elements are also found in the human body: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, potassium, sulfur. You know, the human body is made up of elements too. It's not just limited to chemistry. So when we define organic compounds, what are we talking about? An organic compound contains carbon. Now, because of the way carbon is in terms of its outer electrons and its molecular structure, this carbon must have 4 bonds in total. So what we end up with is a carbon that has 4 bonds extending out from it. And this can be bonded to hydrogen, it can be bonded to oxygen, it can be bonded to nitrogen. It really depends on what compound we're talking about. But that's rule number 1. The organic compounds will have some covalent bonds present. So remember, when we talk about covalent bonds, it's the whole idea that you're sharing electrons. Okay. The other thing is that a lot of the time they have low melting points and low boiling points as well. Like, they're not very complicated compounds. But we must bear in mind that if it's a 2-carbon compound compared to a 10-carbon compound, in terms of their melting points between themselves, they will be variable. They also react very slowly because they have very complex bonding in place. And they could obviously form very large molecules. Now, having said this, when we talk about organic compounds, we'll be talking about different families. So it's very, the list goes on forever. So hydrocarbons is the first one we will talk about today, okay? We can also look at alcohols. We can look at acids, such as carboxylic acids. We will talk about esters. We can look at amines and amides and ketones, etc. Now, the key thing about organic compounds is the idea that they are named after a specific group being present in them. So let me give you an example. So if, for instance, we were to take hydrocarbons, the reason it's called hydrocarbons is because it's got hydrogen and carbon present. The reason this is an alcohol group is because it's got the OH group present. This is an aldehyde group. This is a carboxylic acid group, so it's got COOH. And it's really important to start sort of recognizing these, okay? Which organic compounds contain the alcohol group, you should be able to say it's OH. Hydrocarbons, you should know it's going to be a CH bond present. And you also need to start looking at the relationship between where we've got single carbon bonds and like double carbon to carbon bonds as well. So again, this is all a little bit about orientation. Here is amine, so this is a amine group, so NH2. So ammonia is like NH4. So it's incorporating a lot of understanding of like your basic elements in chemistry. In terms of the ones we will be focusing on today, we're going to be looking at hydrocarbons for sure. We will be looking at alcohols as well, and we will also touch on acids and esters. One thing we will find today is that all of these compounds are quite amazing in the sense that they can all be converted into one another by a different series of reactions. And sadly for you guys, you have to memorize those as well for your exams. So let's start off with carbon. Now, when we talk about carbon, atoms can bond together to make straight chains, branch chains, or rings, and we can see that over here in these examples on the right. We've got straight chain carbons, and we've got branch changed carbons, and we've got cyclic carbons as well. These have a very particular name for them. Now, a carbon atom can potentially form 4 different types of bonds. It can bond to hydrogen, it can bond to nitrogen, it can bond to oxygen. It really depends on what the compound is that we are talking about. Okay? The other thing we need to know about carbon is when a carbon bonds, it's bonding with very, very strong covalent bonds. Again, remember when we talk about covalent bonds, it's all about the sharing of electrons. The carbon atom here and the carbon atom here are sharing their electrons to complete their outer shells. What we also need to remember is that a carbon to carbon bond, for example, doesn't necessarily have to be single. It can be double or it can be triple bond. The key thing we have to remember here is that a carbon could only have 4 bonds associated with it within the laws of chemistry, okay? Simply because it's only got 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons on the outside, so it can't have more than 4 bonds coming off it. So for example, when we are expected to draw these, we have to bear that rule in mind. We can't start drawing carbon with like 6 bonds coming out of it. It has to be 4 bonds and that's it. And that becomes, we need to become mindful of that when we start drawing things like, for example, we've got a carbon to carbon here, and naturally we would want to draw the hydrogens, right? So right now this carbon has 4 bonds. But if I was to tell you this carbon, and this is a mistake students make a lot in exams, you're asked to draw a double bond between the carbon to carbon atoms, and then you sit there and think, okay, I'm done. But what you don't take a minute to think about is how many bonds are actually coming off our single carbon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So something's wrong here. And what you realize is you have to keep the double bond because that's what's constituting this compound. So you end up having to remove one of the hydrogens. And this is something to be really, really mindful of. Never forget to count the number of bonds coming off your carbon. It's always a rule of 4. Now, when we talk about carbon to carbon double bonds and single bonds, when we have a single bond present, it's a saturated bond. And when there is a double bond present, it's an unsaturated one. So this is just some of the phrases we use to sort of explain what we're seeing. Okay? Now, atoms often bond with hydrogen to make hydrocarbons, and hydrocarbons is something we're going to talk to the end of time today. Okay, this is one of the key compounds that carbon will make. Okay, and hydrocarbons are very, very important because they become the base material for lots and lots of things that we can use in industry. Okay, and as you can see, again, the hydrocarbons itself are very, very versatile. Here we've got a straight structure of hydrocarbons. Here is a cyclic structure, so I believe this is like a benzene ring. And again, this is all possible because again they are forming covalent bonds. Again, putting it into context, when we talk about carbon, we're not just talking about chemistry. Carbon is found everywhere in the human body. I mean, if you look at how versatile carbon is, carbon compounds are things like carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. And if you really break them down, you can see like they're all constituting carbon, and they're all found very, very deeply integrated into the human body and life itself. When we talk about these elements, we're not just talking about them in a chemical lab. We need to discuss something called the homologous series. The first thing I want you to know is that they are hydrocarbons, okay? So they're going to have that carbon and hydrogen bonds being present. When we talk about alkanes, we are basically, so if I was to show you, when we talk about alkanes, this is a very basic one. The carbon-to-carbon bond I was referring to is this. In an alkane, okay, we have the carbon-to-carbon double bond, we have a carbon-to-carbon single bond being present, okay? And this is what we call saturated. And in an alkene, it's a unsaturated bond, okay? That's the first thing to remember. If you can really remember this distinction, you're setting yourself an excellent platform to learn more about these compounds. So, when we define homologous series, there are groups of compounds with similar chemical properties. They all share the same general formula. So, for example, alkanes are all hydrocarbons with a single carbon-to-carbon bond, and they have a general formula that's CnH2n plus 2. Now, don't worry, we're going to sort of walk through this in a minute. So when we talk about a general formula, it's basically something we use to figure out what each of the compounds could be in this homologous series. So, for example, if I was to tell you n can be substituted into any number, we can use this general formula to figure out how many carbons and hydrogens will be present. So say if I was to tell you n equals 3, okay? So, and the general formula for your alkanes is CnH2n plus 2. So what we basically need to do is we need to incorporate this 3 into this. So if n is 3, so in this case it will be C3, and it will be 2n, so it will be 3 times 2 plus 2. So in this scenario, 3 times 2 is 6, plus 2 is 8. And that would be the general formula of your alkane. Now, what you can then be expected to do is perhaps draw this. Then we can check whether our general formula is correct or not. So does this look right to us? So if I was to draw C3H8, first of all, we know that it's an alkane, so we know it's going to be carbon-to-carbon single bonds. Okay? There's no double bonds involved. The other thing we will then be reminded about is the fact that we've been told that it's only carbons and hydrogens present. So that's really important. So when I draw these, and you will be expected to draw them in your exam, so I'm going to go through a couple of examples later. We've got 3 carbons, and then we need to draw 8 hydrogens. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I always encourage students to not draw these blindly, simply because it's very easy to make a mistake. So I know that I've drawn an alkane. So I need to make sure what I've drawn matches my general formula. Do I have 3 carbons? 1, 2, 3. I'm happy with that. Do I have 8 hydrogens? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the last thing I want to check is that my carbon-to-carbon bonds are single, and that every single carbon only has 4 bonds coming off it. 1, 2, 3, 4. And therefore I sort of followed all the rules of this general formula, and I'm happy that what I have drawn is correct. Okay? Now, let's do another example. So if they're telling us we've got the general formula that's CnH2n plus 2, it says guess the next one in the series. So this is CH4, then we've got C2H6. Now we've done C3H8. Now let's do the next one. So if this was the next one in the series, it would be C4, okay? And if we're saying N equals to 4, okay, we need to all incorporate that into our general formula. So it'd be H 2 times 4 plus 2. And that should give us C4H, 2 times 4 is 8, 8 plus 2 is 10. So that can be a first part of an exam question. Then they can say draw it. So let's follow the rule. Let's draw out our carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we know that our carbons have to have single bonds, and we've shown that. And each carbon has to have 4 bonds coming off it, and we know the only other bonds present is the ones with hydrogen. And I always think when you're practicing general formulas, always practice drawing them out too. It really puts things into perspective. So again, if I was in an exam, I would want to check exactly what I've drawn. Do I have single carbon bonds present? Good. I've got 4 carbons, and do I have 10 hydrogens? 4, 8, 9, 10. And we've only got 4 bonds coming off each carbon. So I'm happy that this is the correct alkane being drawn. And I've left one other example in there for you too. So take your time to practice these, draw each one out, and that will help you become more familiar with the general formula. And then you've got C5H12. Now, this can go on infinitely. So you could have C10, C14, C18. You could just go on and on, but you would always be able to figure out what the carbon and hydrogen composition is if you follow the general formula. Now, in terms of uses of alkanes, alkanes are again very, very versatile. You can use them as methane for natural gas. Ethane, propane, butane are gases at room temperature, and they're used as fuels. We've got things like Vaseline and wax candles as well. So when we look at alkenes, so remember we were saying that alkanes have carbon-to-carbon single bonds. When we talk about alkenes, we're saying that all hydrocarbons with at least one carbon-to-carbon double bond, and they have a general formula that's CnH2n. If some of you find some of this information confusing, please don't panic. We're going to be covering this in multiple ways today. And sometimes when we learn about new things, it can seem a bit overwhelming, but we will walk through it multiple times and we will be repeating it because repetition is key. Okay, so just hold on to the facts I'm throwing at you at the moment. So alkanes, key thing about alkanes is that it's a carbon-to-carbon double bond being present. It's a game changer. It's an unsaturated carbon-to-carbon double bond. And then it obviously constitutes a different general formula. And here the formula is CnH2n, which is a little bit easier. So if we took this as an example, the general formula is then CnH2n. So if, let me walk you through a written one. So let's take, if say for example, N is 4, so it's CnH2n. All we're doing is we're incorporating the 4 into the N. So here it ends up being 2 times 4, and very easily you're able to work out that it's C4H8. And then it's about drawing this. And when we draw something like this, let's follow one, two, three, 4. And this is the one where you have to be really, really mindful about how many hydrogens you're drawing. So it's 1, 2, 3. I can't draw another hydrogen because that'll be 4, and then it'll be 1, 2. So always double check your carbons with the double bonds because it can become very easily confused. So this has got 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm happy with that. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is C4H8. And if you guys hold on to the nomenclature rules I was talking to you about, so what you will start seeing is that anytime it's an alkene, it's going to end in -ene. Okay, and that's going to be the end of the name, as you can see over here. And the start of it will be determined by how many high carbons we have. So just to sort of introduce this to you, if it was 2 carbons, it would start off with, if it was 1 carbon, it wouldn't be 1 carbon, so it would be 2 carbons, it would be ethene. If it was 3 carbons, it would be propene. And if it was 5 carbons, we have butene. Sorry, not butene, pentene. 4 would be butene. Okay? Now, all I'm drawing your attention to is the idea that when we have your alkenes, we are referring to, first of all, the ene at the end. This is how you know a carbon-to-carbon double bond is present, okay? And then this is the prefix I was talking to you about. If it's 2 carbon atoms, it's going to be eth. If it's 3 carbon atoms, it's prop. And if it's 5 carbon atoms, it's pent in this sense, okay? I will show you a table at one point to show you how all these nomenclatures work, but it's nice to sort of start throwing this in there too so you become more familiar with it. Now, again, can you guess the next one in the series? This is more for your revision purposes when you're sort of testing yourself later, but this is what I was saying. It can be C2H4, so again, this would be ethene. C3H6 would be propene. The next one would be butene, so C4H8. And the next one would be pentene. So just to give you an example of how we would draw this, if this came up in your exam questions, then draw the displayed formula of C2H4. All you have to do is write 2 carbons, first of all, is step number 1. Then you want to know, is this an alkene? We're talking about an alkane. Now we know that it's an alkene, and we know that this is a general formula. Then what we know is that it has to have a double bond, okay? So now I'm happy that I've got 2 carbons and I've also whacked in a double bond. Then I need to make sure my carbons have 4 bonds coming off them and no more, and the fact that they're all hydrogens. So I can put a hydrogen here, I can put a hydrogen here, and I can put a hydrogen here and a hydrogen here. And this would give you your ethene. And again, always double check. Sometimes in your exams, it's very easy to rush. So there's my double bond. Each carbon is bonded 4 times, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I would be happy that this is the correct display formula for this alkene. Now, another thing we need to remember about groups in the homologous series is the idea that as the number of carbon atoms increases, the physical properties of the compounds change. When we talk about the physical properties, we're talking about the mass. So what you can imagine is as the mass increases with the number of carbon atoms increasing, it makes sense why the mass would increase. As the number of carbon atoms increase, we've got more bonds being present, and the intermolecular forces will therefore also increase. Same applies for viscosity. As the carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms increase, we're increasing the general mass and the structure of our compound, therefore the viscosity will also increase. Now, for instance, we've got CH, so we've got a bunch of alkenes here, and alkanes here, and what you can basically see is that as we go down, so here we've got 1 carbon, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and as the carbon numbers are increasing, the mass, you can see, is evidently increasing. The melting point and boiling points are also increasing, and they are changing states in terms of gas to then liquid. So where C10 is a liquid at room temperature, CH4 is a gas at room temperature. And this is simply because the larger the molecular formula, the more hydrogens and carbons present, the stronger the intermolecular forces, the harder it is to break them apart, and hence why we need more energy to do so. So The mass increases, the intermolecular forces strengthen, which leads to the increase in melting point and boiling point. Compounds become more viscous and less volatile, and they're more difficult to burn, simply because to burn something you need to add enough heat energy to break the bonds. If I'm telling you I've got like 10 to 20 plus bonds present, we're obviously going to need a lot of heat energy to achieve that breakage. Now, when we talk about naming compounds in a homologous series, this is the nomenclature I was referring to. Naming compounds in organic chemistry is like writing a code. So the suffix, which is the end of the word, indicates which homologous series it belongs to. Okay? So what I mean to say is, if it's an ane, it belongs to the alkane group. If it's an ene, it belongs to an alkene group. If it's an alcohol, it belongs to the ols group, okay, like ethanol or propanol. The other ones we can talk about are things like carboxylic acids. So carboxylic acids would have oic acid at the end of them, okay? So these are the three standard ones you have to remember. And as an additional, because we need to have, it's good to have more information, remember this one, carbon to carbon single bonds. These ones are carbon to carbon double bonds. And these ones are going to be OH group being present in them. Okay? Now, then on the flip side is the prefix. And this is the word at the start of the compound's name. So it's the prefix. And this indicates how many carbon atoms are present in the compound. So remember, the suffix is referring to the general formula, and it's referring to the particular bond being present in the compound. And when we talk about the prefix, it's talking about the carbon atoms. And the prefix will always be the same regardless of which homologous family we're talking about. It just depends on what the fancy group is. So if the number of carbons is 1, it's meth. If the number of carbons are 2, it's eth. If the number of carbons are 3, it's prop. If the number of carbons are 4, is bute. And if the number of carbons are 5, is pent. Now, as you can see, regardless of which family of compounds we're talking about, the prefixes don't change unless the number of carbons are changing. What I mean to say is, we can have ethene, and we can have ethane, or we can have ethanol. So, and then it's up to you to decipher which one's which. So we've got ethane, we have ethene, and we have ethanol. And by the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify that this one is an alkane, and this one has carbon to carbon single bonds. This is an alkene, and this will have carbon to carbon double bonds. This is an ethanol, and this will have the OH group attached to it at one of the ends of the formula. Okay? Very, very important to make these distinctions. And obviously, the other thing you would draw away from this would be the fact that because it's eth, you know that the number of carbons will be 2. Again, propane. This is propane simply because, now this is an interesting one. When we talk about naming these compounds, we need to look for the straight chain first, the longest straight chain. And the longest straight chain in this scenario is 1, 2, 3. It's 3 carbon atoms long. So therefore, this is technically propane. And what you would do is, this is then constituted as a methyl group. So it would be, when we name this, this is a little bit beyond the scope of the lecture, but we would basically name this in the sense that we've got the propane being present, but we also have a methyl group being present too. And it turns into something like 2-methyl propane, and it's 2 because this methyl group, so the CH3, is coming off the second carbon atom. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to is, if this this compound was drawn out like this instead, it's completely different. And this scenario, with no doubt, if you guys were shown something like this, you should be very confident in naming it. So first of all, if I was to draw something like this for you, my first question is, what is it? Is there any carbon-to-carbon bonds present? No, it's carbon-to-carbon single bond, so I know it's an ane. Then the next thing I want to look at is how many bonds, how many carbons are actually being read. So we've got 1, we've got 2, we've got 3, we've got 4. And if I know anything about my prefixes, I know that when I have 4 carbons present, my prefix will be but. And this is how we end up naming it butane. Okay, let's do a different example. If we had something like if they showed you the display formula like this and they asked you to explain what this compound was, the first thing you always do is read how many. First of all, look at your bonds, figure out the suffix. So we can see we've got a carbon-to-carbon double bond here, so I know this is going to end in an ene. Okay, it's an alkene already, I know that. Now the next thing I want to know is how many carbons are present. We've got 1, 2, 3, and if I know anything about my prefixes, I know when I have 3 carbon atoms present, it's going to be a prop, propene. And this is just how you approach trying to name these very simple molecules. So, question number 1. Alkenes can be made by cracking large alkane molecules. Explain how the cracking process is carried out. We said that we are going to take long hydrocarbon chains. And where did we say these were coming from? They were coming from things like your crude oil. And we were going to break these up into alkenes and smaller hydrocarbons. Okay, how is this process carried out? Remember, I gave you 2 examples of cracking. You could do steam cracking or you could do catalytic cracking. So in a catalytic cracking, you take the alkane, the long hydrocarbon chain, and you heat it up at very, very high pressures, add in a catalyst, and then you break it apart. So as you can see over here, it says by heating, and you use a catalyst such as aluminium oxide. You can use a ceramic part or porcelain. I would normally stick to the generic idea of using heat and a catalyst. You don't have to be fancy, just to say which catalyst is. If you remember that it's aluminium oxide, by all means say that. And that's how you end up producing an alkene. So key take-home message: long hydrocarbon chains derived from crude oil, not that useful. What we can do is we can break them down into smaller components such as alkenes and smaller hydrocarbon chains, and we do this with steam catalytic cracking. We can do it with steam cracking or catalytic cracking. The one they commonly refer to in your exams is the catalytic cracking, where you're heating it up and using a catalyst to break it down. Next part of the question, it says give a chemical test which would show the difference between an alkene and an alkane. Okay, this is the bromine test I was talking about. Remember I said due to the presence of the double bond, the alkane, remember we said that the alkene double bond would be completely saturated and it would turn the bromine water from brown to colorless. Okay, so it says use bromine water. Alkene makes the bromine go colorless or it loses its color. Okay, if the bromine water was not to change, it would mean that it's the presence of an alkane. And the reason this happens is because the alkene will undergo an addition reaction with the bromine, and therefore in the final product, there's no more bromine left. So where would the color come from? That bond has been saturated. We've produced a bromine incorporated into an alkane. Therefore, there is no more brown solution. Okay. The concept of this experiment is based by the fact that we are saturating that carbon-to-carbon double bond that causes the bromine original molecule to no longer be present, and the water goes from brown to clearless. This is what you would see. And for those asking which experiments we need to know for the classroom, this one is a very common one. So when we react bromine water with alkane, it does not react and it does not decolorize the bromine water. When we react bromine water with an alkene, such as it will decolorize the bromine water, and that tests for the presence of the carbon to carbon double bond. Alkenes such as ethene can be made into polymers. Complete the following to show how the ethene molecule bond to form part of the polymer. So this is why we're saying we are going to go through lots and lots of exam questions and lots of things to be able to reinforce that knowledge. So first it says complete the following to show how the ethene molecules bond to form part of the polymer. Remember, this is an addition polymerization. And I told you very, very well that the only thing we need to do is break up this double bond. Everything else stays the same. So when I draw this, I'm drawing the repeating unit, okay? So I want to keep my carbons the same. I want to keep the hydrogens the same. And all I've done is drawn the new repeating unit. And in your exams, they expect you to draw the repeating unit like this, and then you would put n here depending on how many repeating units there are. So this is complete the following to show how the ethene molecules bond to form part of the polymer. So what you would then do is, so that's your repeating unit. If we want to show exactly what's happening in this repeating unit, so let's take the liberty of drawing this. So there's 3, right? So we would end up drawing 3 of these. So there's my second one. And then I would draw my last one. So you can see all I have basically done is opened up the double bond. That's all you're doing in additional polymerization. It doesn't get easier than that. Okay. Now, the other thing, next part of the question says, name the polymer formed from ethene. So remember, it's going to be, because it's repeated, it's poly, okay, because it's repeated. And because it's from ethene, remember, if we have broken down the constituent double bond, it's now an ane. And because it's from ethene with the 2 carbon bonds originally, it's going to be polyethene. Okay. So if you look over now, if we looked at the exam question paper, if we looked at this, so let me just get rid of my drawing. If you look over here, it says either of these must show bonds at the end, as you can see over here, or so you can draw it open, or you can draw the repeating unit like this, okay? And that's what we're talking about. So remember, all we are doing is we're cracking open that double bond and drawing that your repeating unit. The N stands for how many repeating units there would be. If they showed you 3, there's 3 of these repeating units. So remember, this is the monomer and we're breaking it down into a polymer chain. That's all. Remember, as the thing, polyethylene, otherwise known as polyethylene, is very, very useful in ethene gas, which is derived from petroleum and natural gas. This can be converted to polyethylene by cracking, okay? So this is just sort of reinforcing the fact that we can take long hydrocarbon chains, convert them into smaller hydrocarbon chains such as alkenes, and then we can use that to do additional polymerization reactions to produce things like this.